This is my journey. Inspired one story at a time, a library of leaders was created. It began as a journey to learn. As time went on, it began to grow. All it needed was a platform, and this podcast was created to listen, to inspire, to share. I am a storyteller, and this is my journey. Today, our guest is Laura Hassner, MBA, who is a faculty member at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and is the Executive Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley and the co-founder and co-director of the Berkeley Changemaker program. It is a set of courses that shape tomorrow's leaders through critical thinking, collaboration, and communication with guest faculty like Secretary Janet Yellen. Today, Lauren is known for helping women align their startups with larger social missions to close the gender gap in raising capital. An expert in turnarounds, she is a former Big Five consultant and financial advisor. She has also taught in a highly challenged urban school and spent a decade innovating new products and programs for a national nonprofit. So, Laura, it's great to have you on today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so just why don't you just start by giving us a little bit of context, kind of where you went to school, where you grew up, and then I know you have some interesting experience as a foreign exchange student. So just kind of give us a little background about what has got you going here.
Thank you. You've clearly done your research. So I am fourth generation to have grown up here in the San Francisco Bay Area. My early years were through a public school system all the way through high school. I did my undergraduate getting a degree in political science at an institution down on the peninsula that's the current rival of the university at which I work. I was at Stanford. And you're
Okay.
correct. I've studied overseas 3 different times. I've been an exchange student in Ecuador when I was in high school, in Santiago, Chile, when I was an undergraduate, and I wrote my thesis on the intersection of international law and human rights in the Pinochet extradition case. So I followed him to the UK when he was arrested there and spent a term studying at Oxford. And then later in life, I went back and got my MBA.
Wow, that's amazing. So, in Chile, you kind of witnessed politics in action, right? So you stayed with a family that was very supportive of this dictator. Is that the right name to call him at the time? But yet you were involved in university or other students that were very involved in protests about his government and what was going on. So just share with us a little bit about what you experienced and what you kind of learned from that.
So I arrived in the fall of 1998, and students of Chilean history might remember that is the time in which General Augusto Pinochet, the dictator who installed himself in power in 1973, stepped down as commander-in-chief of the armed forces and assumed his position as senator for life, thanks to a constitution that he rewrote while he was in power. So I was in Santiago during that time of transition. And it's something, when your textbooks come alive, this is something I'd read about. And I went from my host family, which were ardent supporters of Pinochet, to the point where they had photographs of him. My host mother wept when she told me of her gratitude towards him and the government that he put in place after a time that she felt was very chaotic in Chilean history. I got on the bus and went to classes that day and saw riots in the streets, tires being burned. It was quite a jarring experience. And then some of my Chilean classmates had family members who, to this day, remain disappeared.
Yeah, and that was kind of one of the, again, I didn't study it obviously as much as you did, but I remember that people just disappeared. That in fact there was I remember, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Sting had a very famous song during that time about the dancing mothers, because they would just go to the parks and dance as a silent protest about family members that just disappeared in a political mess.
Thousands of them disappeared. And Yeah, it was an incredible time in history. I had gone down to be to really, I thought, research the women's movement in overthrowing Salvador Allende and then in the Pinochet dictatorship. And when I saw what happened, I realized I couldn't study anything else. And so when he was arrested in the UK, recovering from back surgery, that's when I followed him and thought, this is something I won't rest until I learn more about.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating for sure. So you have this great college experience, and you're studying abroad, and then you come back and you go into the world of finance. So that's pretty different from history. So tell us what led you to that.
You're unearthing all the secrets here. So at the time, Arthur Anderson had a division called Global Corporate Finance. And I honestly, as looking at my background, didn't know anything about the corporate finance part, but I felt like I'd had some experience with the global part. And I was fortunate enough to interview with the managing partner of the corporate turnarounds team. And he helped me to understand that at the time, Arthur Andersen had one of the best training programs in corporate America. They had bought a campus in St. Charles, Illinois. And the first thing they did was send me to accounting class to qualify to sit for the CPA. Never took the exam, but did 6 weeks of accounting from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. as my first 6 weeks on the job, and then went to St. Charles to learn about restructuring. And the reason why I chose turnarounds and restructuring as my first career is that I felt like it would give me the best possible insight into business. I had had some exposure into international law and writing my thesis and some exposure into academia, but business was this big, brave new world that I didn't know a lot about.
Yeah, and then you went on to helping women with startups, founders, raising capital by pairing their startup or their idea with a mission. So tell us about that philosophy and why you think that was effective.
Oh, thank you. So, to clarify, I'm not just women. I don't work exclusively with women.
Okay.
Although the national education nonprofit I worked with focused on both genders, men and women. And then I've continued to work with both men and women. I've been particularly interested in the role that women play because it seems to be more challenging for women to start companies, for women to raise the capital that they need. So your question, if I remember correctly, was around purpose driven. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I mean it sounds like you help them come up with not only a business strategy but a mission as well, to so t tell us about why you think that's effective or important.
So, well, perhaps the most important thing in starting up an enterprise is that it has to be profitable, right?
Right.
Our founders need to find a market niche and solve a need that customers are willing to pay for. One of the reasons that we at UC Berkeley have been so successful, in fact, a pitch book just ranked us number one globally in for venture-backed startups, for venture-backed for female founded companies, for female founders, and for capital raised by women. So, five different categories is because here at UC Berkeley, people seem to be interested in our mission, which is that of long term societal benefit. So, one of the things that I focus on when I'm asked to coach or mentor startup teams is to help connect them to their purpose. So, why are we doing this? Not only are we serving a need that customers are willing to pay for, but is there some larger goal that we might be able to think about that help to paint the largest possible picture? That helps us to motivate not only our employers, but it helps us to convey and paint a really powerful story for the marketplace that I
Yeah.
think is a compelling one for consumers as well.
And so now you're in academia, you working with students. So how do you get, I think I can remember back when I was a college student, and how do you get students to think that what they do in life or what they want to do in life has an impact on the greater world? Because it tends to be a pretty me thing, as a student, just trying to get through and get your credential and getting your degree and so on. So how do you get them to see something bigger and broader with having a bigger impact?
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack in that statement because you're right. The pressures that college students are facing are enormous these days. Increased tuition expenses, and many of our students are also caring for family members, holding down full-time jobs. So just juggling so many responsibilities in addition to what they are doing in their role as students. So you're right, there is a lot of head down needing to get through the academic experience, often pressure to be a breadwinner for their families as they do so. I developed a course called Living with Agency that I've been teaching at the business school to undergraduates for 4 years now. And that course really came about from my own experience entering the consulting world and feeling like other people seem to have access to a set of skills that if I had just had access to, it would have been so much easier. And so, to your larger question, one of the first things that I do in that class is I have my students clarify their values. I have them do a values card sort exercise. You can Google this, it's widely available and in the public domain, to help them to prioritize what's most important to them. Then I have them craft a purpose statement, and then I have them do things like set goals. So, in other words, what I ask them to do is to get more clarity on who they are. And I use the semester length course, which at UC Berkeley is 15 weeks, to help them to have and carve out that valuable time for self reflection so that they can get a lot more clear on what they value and also develop the skills grounded in evidence based research and practices and tools from the business world that help them to accomplish those goals. How did I do answering your question?
That's great, but I have more questions from that.
Yes,
So I'm
please.
thinking is like, again, students, thinking about getting this degree and things that interest them. This is a course that has a title that, may not be too catchy. It's kind of like, well, why would I take this course? And so, what students are you seeing that sign up for this course, and how do they come in with one maybe bias or idea, and how do they change throughout the course?
Ooh. So the fire marshal only allows 48 students in my class. I am proud that I have 23 different majors represented every semester I've taught this course. So we are
Wow.
talking rich disciplinary perspectives, students coming from all over campus. They don't know what it means to live with agency, right? The term isn't very descriptive, it's not very clear. So one of the first things that I do is I present them with different academic views on what agency is. I teach things like self determination, self efficacy, and others. But my students will tell you I never define what it means for them to live with agency. That's something they have to figure out for themselves over the course of the 15 weeks. So, in answer to your question, what are students bringing into the class and how are they changing? I think it's a Berkeley Changemaker class, and we find that students, and we enroll roughly 20% of undergraduates at UC Berkeley have taken one of our over 40 Berkeley Changemaker courses. And we find that students are attracted to our courses because they want something more. They want to sharpen the impact that they make, not just on their time here at UC Berkeley, but on the world. And they are hungry for the skills that will help them to be able to do that. So, the types of students that are in my course, it's upper divisions. So they tend to be in their third or final year at UC Berkeley. They're starting to orient outwards to figure out what is that impact? What are my next steps after I leave Berkeley? And so they're often using my course to help figure that out for themselves.
Okay, and the Berkeley Changemaker program is not a division of the university, so it's not like mathematics or other divisions. So this is something that goes across all departments. Is this unique in the universities today, or is this a uh, was Berkeley an innovator in this type of program?
I think there's no coincidence that a program like the Berkeley Changemaker, which is at its heart an academic program, started in our Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. We've since moved it to the Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education so that it sits at the heart of undergraduate education. But we remain very much a startup at the university. At large institutions like UC Berkeley, curricular innovation like ours, and ours is a cross disciplinary program as you alluded to, really happens at the margins. So our program relies almost exclusively on the generosity of philanthropic donors and on any revenue that we might be able to generate. We don't receive any money from Central Campus. So it also, much like a startup, has its own unique funding model. As far as, is there anything like it anywhere else in universities? Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. And in doing some research for this interview, I also heard you say that you encourage students to question the status quo. And you know, someone from my vintage, we looked at Berkeley as a campus that always did that, that was not afraid to go out and let people know what they felt and how they thought things should change. And is that still the Berkeley that we know? Has it changed? Has it gone through some transformations? What's Berkeley like today in that sense?
Beautiful question. My parents were at Berkeley in the 1960s. And I think so many of us remember Mario Savio on top of the police car and the beginning of the free speech movement as happening at Berkeley. You're correct. We lean into the culture of questioning the status quo because that's the way in which we ask, and our students continue to ask to this day, isn't there a better way we might be doing this? That's really in the DNA and the ethos at Berkeley. It always has been. I mean, that's the key thing about culture, and that's why I'm so interested in studying culture and learning more about culture. Is in order to be able to name the culture, right? You have to be able to tease out what is in the air. And I think people have, for generations, my family and myself included, come to Berkeley to ask, isn't there a better way we could do this? I think we've evolved though since the 1960s in the ways in which we do this, but we are continue to graduate deep thinkers who are going on to shape their industries. You alluded earlier to Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, former faculty at Berkeley, but we have and we continue to have so many people who go on to revolutionize their industries.
And also, when you work with executives and professionals that are now out in the business world or the working world, and what do you tell them, or how do you encourage them to mentor students and new grads and people that kind of would really benefit from that mentoring? Do they have time? Are they interested, or is that a tough ask?
I'm so glad that you asked me this question. Thank you. Because I feel really passionate about this. It wasn't until I came to the business school and met our then dean, now Chancellor Rich Lyons, that I learned about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. So anyone who comes into my classroom or speaks to me about this will learn about sponsorship. Do you know the difference, Stephen?
Absolutely. It's that sponsorship is the highest level where you're basically willing to put your reputation on the line for the student or a mentee, that I'm recommending you, and that's a big ask, because if they screw up, then it kind of comes back on you, so to speak, in a way.
You nailed it. A sponsor is actively agitating to get you a seat at the table. And in all of the research that I've done on women, because we've been speaking about that a little bit, that's key in helping to advance careers. So, first thing I do is make sure that everyone is familiar with the difference between mentors and sponsors, because I have found, and my students have found, that people instinctively want to help. They
Yeah.
don't necessarily know how. So clarifying what we are asking of them is key, I think, to having a successful relationship, whether you are the mentor or the mentee, or whether you're asking for someone to sponsor you.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really important because there's really four levels. There's the teaching, then there's the coaching and the mentoring, and as we just talked about, the sponsorship. So those are all a little different, and I don't think people look at them as differently as they should, because as we said, if you mentor somebody or coach somebody and you know them and trust them, then you're going to be willing to sponsor them. Then you're going to be willing to call somebody and say, hey, I bet on this person, and I think you won't be sorry if you allow them to do this. And so, as I said earlier, you're kind of putting your reputation on the line with that kind of an endorsement.
Definitely a vulnerable position to be in as a sponsor. You are being your on the line. Also, until I was in a school that I had heard the idea of a personal board of directors. Have you heard
Yeah,
about that?
I have, yeah. I mean, it's pretty impressive. Yeah, if that's a tough ask, but what I tell my clients and younger people that I work with too is that you just have to be willing to ask the question because most people are very willing to do and help, but they're not often asked.
Exactly. So part of what I try to do in my courses is to make that visible to students, to help them structure the ways in which they might ask, to be really clear on what their needs are, and also to be really clear if you're reaching out to someone for a coffee conversation, that it is just that, that if you want to have a chat about their career, you are learning more about their career. You're not asking for a job up front. And I think so many students anticipate or hope that in the context of 15 minutes, they will land whatever it is they need. So I see part of my job also is to help set the ground rules to set up successful mentorships and sponsorships later down the road. But that's a long process.
Yeah, I remember I was lecturing at a university once, and at the end of the lecture, a gentleman came up and said, "I was really impressed with what you said. It really resonated with me, and I'd like to come and just shadow you for a few days to see what you do, to see what, you know." And I was the CEO of a fairly big healthcare company, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this guy? I mean, I talk on the phone, go to meetings, I travel around, do stuff, and I kind of tried to, say, well, I don't know if, and he goes, no, no, I really want to do it. I really want to do it. And so I said, what the heck? So he came and he just sat there and watched me during meetings and listened to me when I was on the phone and asked questions in between times. And I think he came for 2, maybe 3 days. And I didn't think too much about it. And then 5 or 6 years later, I got this amazing note from him about how that so changed his thought, thinking of business and how to do things, and made such an impact. And credited me for giving him the boost to get to where he is. And it was just it reminded me of how impactful that little thing that didn't take anything from me did for somebody else and made a difference. So I totally support the idea of doing things like that.
I hear two things in what you're saying. The first is really the importance of experiential learning and investigating your potential future career. That's something I can't emphasize enough to my students is, for example, I have a number of students in any given year who have decided that they want to go to law school. So the first question they ask of them is, well, do you actually like the law?
Yeah.
Do you know what it means to practice law? Have you shadowed lawyers in fields that you're interested in? Do you know what it means to be a lawyer? What do they do every day? Does that meet your view for yourself for the future, right? And then the same in whatever that industry is, because we learn the academic skills to prepare us in the classroom, but we don't necessarily learn what it's like when you're actually. So kudos to you
Yeah.
for shadowing someone. The second thing you
Yeah.
said that really stands out to me is the importance of when someone is generous enough to share their advice with us, to share their time with us, it's so important that we follow up, that we share with them the impact that they've made on our lives. I think it's too often we send that automatic thank you note within 24 hours after the conversation. But for people like you and me, it's those letters that we get later where
Yeah.
we learn the impact that I feel that's why I do what I do. I don't know if that's true for you too.
No, absolutely. And what it reinforces to me more than anything is what I alluded to earlier is that things that you think are fairly inconsequential or not that big a deal or whatever, and then you find out later that it was, to them it was so impactful. So don't think you have to have this, great aha moment in the experience. It can just be being available and sharing what you know. And even if you think it's no big deal, it could be a big deal.
A great example of that from my class. So it took me over a year to design this class. Since I have a full-time staff role, it was really nights and weekends and a passion project of mine for living with agency. And I spent so much time trying to become an expert in the literature around all the domains that I teach in my course. Of course, I'm never going to be the expert in any of them, but I tried very hard to learn as much as I could about all of the topics and structure this course around conveying evidence-based research. And then I asked my students who graduated, who come back years later, like, what part of the course do you use the most? And do you know what they say, Stephen?
What?
This thing that I bring in that is not at all grounded in evidence. It's something I learned from my dad. And so I do this like big framing and I say, okay, I'm going to step away and I'm going to share something with you that I have found to be true in my life. I call it the Paxton Rule of Three. It's my maiden name and I got it from my dad. And it is that when you are entering a new situation, particularly in the professional world, think you're going to a networking conference or professional conference for the first time, it feels really awkward. It feels uncomfortable, and you are going up cold to people that you do not know who may be movers and shakers in the field and luminaries that, and you're just hoping to break in, and they have no idea who you are, and you are having a stilted, uncomfortable, cold conversation. That's the first time. The second time you go, chances are they don't even remember having had that first conversation with you, right? You are
Yeah.
repeating this, but what my dad told me and what I held close was that sometime around that third interaction, some magical alchemy seems to happen, and you become absorbed into the group as one of their own. And so, what I tell my students is embrace the discomfort of those first few times, knowing that almost all the time it gets better, and
Yeah.
then it is your job, of course, to make those people who are coming for the first time feel welcome and absorb them into the group a little bit sooner.
Exactly, exactly. If you've been there and been in that awkward situation, help those that you know are going through the same thing
Pay
because
it
it's
forward.
yeah, absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely. So speaking of threes, another thing that that I discovered is that you kind of believe in the three C's when you teach. So tell us about the three C's and why they're so important.
Thank you. The three C's are the through lines of the Berkeley Changemaker. They are critical thinking, communication, and collaboration. And when we talk about critical thinking, what we mean is really how do we help our students ask the quote unquote right questions? The questions that help them to identify and sharpen the impact that they want to make. The By communication, we know students come to UC Berkeley and universities like ours as strong analytical writers because that's one of the skills you need to have to be admitted to a place like UC Berkeley. But
Oh,
not all of our students have experience in persuasive writing or persuasive communication, and fewer still have the confidence and the skills to stand up in front of a room and influence others, especially when they might not have formal authority. So that's the second C, communication. The third, collaboration. You and I will do our most important life's work with and through other people.
mhm.
So, how do we harness the diverse lived experience of that team to superpower the change that we seek? That's collaboration. And it happens, we never designed an academic curriculum to resonate with what employers say are most lacking in college graduates, but it happens to line up to the three things employers say are lacking. They call them problem solving. That's what we call critical thinking, communication. And then I think they usually use the word teaming or teamwork. That's collaboration.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and it's interesting too because I know that in my field as in physical therapy, you know, it's become very competitive to get into school. And you know, you take a school like UC Berkeley and Harvard and Stanford, and you have experience in those institutions, and it's just you know, to get in, you have to be this critical thinker and achieve these amazing things. Yet some of these skills that you just talked about, communication and collaboration, are, I would argue, are more important. And so, how do you make sure that your program and that your institution finds those people too, so that you're just not working with a bunch of brainiacs that maybe lack in, in the communication and collaboration area?
Well, that's a great question. So we started Berkeley Changemaker with a single course that taught the evidence-based research and theory around these three C's, and then invited Berkeley luminaries from across campus to share what it looks like in their discipline. We then solicited through a generous donor a request for proposals that led to 5 more classes. All of the others, however, this over 40 now, have been faculty coming to us and saying, I teach critical thinking, communication, and collaboration, and I want to teach the kind of students that enroll in Berkeley Changemaker courses. So how do we make sure that we're doing it? We're having faculty actually coming to us and saying, I value these skills, I highlight them, I emphasize them in my courses, and I teach them to our students. So we actually developed through student demand what we call a certificate of completion. It's really a LinkedIn badge. Students wanted a way to communicate to employers that they were skilled in these really important things. And what we're starting to hear now is employers at Berkeley being interested in learning more about our Berkeley Changemakers. So on our website, we actually have mock interviews that help our students connect what they're learning in the classroom to a job or internship interview.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what caught my attention, that this program, because to me, you're basically talking about leadership in a general sense. And I've said this many times on this podcast before, that it's the one thing that covers every single career and division and whatever leadership. Yet, I would argue it's probably one of the least taught things in our formal education process. So, I commend you for acknowledging that and coming up with a program that tries to link all these other things together with that common theme of leadership, communication, things that really do make the bigger difference in the real world.
Love to take all the credit for it, but this really is a team effort. This is a campus spanning endeavor. We've just been improved and buoyed up by the contributions of luminaries from across campus who've really thought deeply about this. Because these are hard topics to teach. We've been talking about the rule of three, and three is a pattern. I've always been told that three is what we remember. That's why we lead with these three. But if I might, Stephen, there's really a fourth, and that's community.
Yeah.
We found that our students, particularly those who have been so deeply impacted by the experience of COVID-19, who've had their educations disrupted, or at least in the traditional sense, many of our students who've just graduated spent part of their formative adolescent years over Zoom in an untraditional learning experience, and they're hungry for being around others, for being in a community. What we didn't know, though, was the extent to which our students would identify as being a Berkeley changemaker, in the sense that they would introduce themselves as, Hi, I'm Laura, and I am a Berkeley changemaker. That one, I have to say, gobsmacked me the first time I
Yeah,
heard it.
absolutely. And you look back on the things we missed and the things we learned during that pandemic. And, I thought it was really interesting that some of the studies have shown that people, really missed, maybe not the deep, team oriented, let's sit down and have this intense conversation, but just things like saying good morning to somebody in the coffee line, or, oh, hey, hi, I saw you the other day. Just little things like that are, I mean, the human species we need community. We need others around. I don't think it really we do as well when we're isolated.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right about that. And it hit home to me. I had never taught at UC Berkeley prior to the pandemic. So all of my experience has been colored by the experience afterwards. And in my first instance of teaching my course, which was an in-person live course, I give my students a break because I'm a lot for 2 hours. So halfway through, we
Yeah.
take a little break, and one of my students said, "Could you put a discussion question on the board so that I know what to say to the person next to me? Because otherwise, we just get on our phones."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought, wow, I was so grateful that they had said that. And what a powerful lesson to me as an educator that, maybe I had been operating at a slightly different level of understanding. And what they really needed was a little bit more of an opportunity to broker connection. So a donor, actually, a very generous donor, funded my class to enable me to bring breakfast for my students.
Nice.
So I bring food every week. Food insecurity is a problem on our campus, like it is on so many other campuses. So you're served hard, hungry, but also a wonderful source of community.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I know that you've talked a lot about too is innovation. So, define innovation. What does innovation mean? I mean, it's such a overused word, but yet I think different people think of it in different ways. So, what does it mean to you?
Great question. Rich Lyons, who is now the chancellor of our university, was our first ever chief innovation and entrepreneurship officer. And our office was founded in January of 2020. And we worked together on creating the Berkeley Changemaker. And one of the first things that we had to do is we were given the title innovation and entrepreneurship, as we had to define both of those terms. So in our office, we define innovation as new ideas or new thinking put into practice. So it's a two-part definition. It's not enough to have that new idea or that new thinking. You actually have to do something with it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
You know, when you're working with leaders in and out of the university setting and in business world too, what do you think the great leaders do that makes them special?
the greatest leaders that I have witnessed in action are capable of painting the biggest picture possible. That vision that we just find so compelling, that is so clear that we understand where our own role and responsibility fits in, but we find so motivating that we, as a member of the organization, are willing to unlock our discretionary talents to make happen. That's probably the
Yeah.
hallmark of the greatest
No,
leaders I've seen.
it's a great response because I do think again, as you can tell, I'm a little bit of a storyteller, and I just remember back when I was a young physical therapist, so passionate about my profession and wanting to be so good, and to be honest with you, so overwhelmed to think, how could I possibly be as good as that person, or how could I possibly get to there? And almost to the point of paralysis. It's just like, oh my gosh. And now I look back on that and just realize it's a process, and you just take one step at a time, and little bits add up over time to be bigger things. And so, that's just what experience teaches you. But I can imagine again, as I was as students or new professionals, I think the overwhelm is something that you just have to address and maybe help people, as you said, see through that to what can be and what could be if you continue on this journey.
If I may, you said in looking back, you realize how did you find the way though at the time, Stephen?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know if I know the answer to it other than I kept going.
Mhm.
So you just forge ahead, and we had a leadership program in our company, and every once in a while, especially the more analytical types I'd say, okay, I want you to go into this year-long program, and they'd say, okay, well, if that takes time away from my clinic and time away from this to do that, then what's my ROI? What's it going to look like at the end of the year? And what do I get out of it? And what's and I'm like, I just say, I can't tell you. All I can tell you is you'll be different. And to an analytical person, personality type, that scares the hell out of them, because they don't know what that means yet from my personality type. I'm kind of like, oh, that could be cool. Okay, let's see how it goes. So different people process it in different ways. And back to your question, I think for me, I was just, I kind of got to the point where I realized that I had to take baby steps to get to where I wanted to be. And I was too impatient at first. I need to be more patient, I guess.
I'm still struggling with that too. But
Yeah.
you're touching on three topics that I was really interested in and teach. One is motivation. One of the most common questions I used to get in office hours before I added a module was, how do I stay motivated when I'm in something for the long haul? The second was the feelings that we navigate around the imposter experience when we're
Yeah.
looking around and seeing what others are doing. Um, and then the third is really I squeeze it into my module on persuasion and influence, but it's really around impact and how do we think about our impact and keep going with our baby steps and also want others to follow us and motivate others to come along with us in the journey.
Yeah, and again, a term and an idea that's been overused so much, but it's true. It's everybody goes through it. As an executive coach, my clients experience this too, as did I, this imposter syndrome. So, you know, you're doing great things and things are going well, but you still, you're afraid that someone's gonna find, think you don't know what you're talking about, or maybe I'm over my head and whatever. So at least talking about it, I think, helps realize that you're not the only one thinking that.
It's so important to give voice to it. There's a wonderful study by Bravata and others in 2020. They did a meta-analysis of, I think, over 20 different academic studies on the imposter experience. And I call it that. My colleague Emily Bruce at Berkeley Law taught me the word imposter experience because she said, if you call it a syndrome, it makes it sound like there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a
I
good
love
point.
that and embraced
Yeah.
it because we know through this meta study and others, it started in the 70s. Suzanne Imes and Pauline Clance studied the imposter syndrome with respect to women. But from this meta study, we know that it's common across gender lines. And unfortunately, it's common at all stages of careers as well. So early stage professionals all the way through late stage professionals. I've read studies saying from somewhere between 70 and 92% of us may have this experience. So for me, it's the first thing I teach in my class, actually, right after I introduce myself to try to not get it out of the way, but to help my students understand that this may just be feelings we're going to have to manage for the entirety of our career.
And do you think in teaching, students and young professionals, because I don't want to make a big deal about it if it isn't, but I'm going to ask you because you see this is it different with men and women? Do you need to give a different message to women than men? Do they look at it differently, or do you think it's just a personality type that doesn't necessarily gender make a difference?
That's a good question. So I teach it the same way, regardless of gender, and invite my students to take away from it whatever feels most helpful to them. I think it is a great relief to particularly my male students who may have been struggling with these feelings to understand that even though it began as a description of women, that is not in fact the case. In other words, feeling the legitimization of those feelings, I think, is really important. I find it's just no. I find presenting my students with the research, they take away from it what they need. I don't know. It'd be interesting to investigate and poll them and see if
Yeah.
it falls along gender lines. But I think also institutions can make us feel like we don't belong. I think I've heard from my students who come from traditionally underserved communities that they may experience that, and so it becomes difficult to unpack all of the different variables that come into those feelings, which we often lump in as feelings of an imposter experience.
Yeah. And I think the common one that we hear a lot about, which, just I've experienced it a little bit in leading people and working with people is, let's say that there are 10 criteria that you need to apply for or do well in this job. And some studies have shown that men, if they have five or maybe six, they'll say, nah, I can wing the rest. I'll go for it. What the heck? Where women tend to say, well, if I don't have eight or nine, then I shouldn't even, apply for this job, or it's not for me or whatever. So that maybe men are a little bit uh, more, I don't know if risk taking is the right word, but maybe naive to say, well, yeah, I'll figure it out as I go, type of thing. So that is one thing that I have seen that I think research has backed up a little bit.
Oh, our research has absolutely backed that up. So I share that research with my students because I think it's important to know. I also share with them personal strategies that I have utilized. For example, sometimes I found it helpful to think about what one of my male colleagues in my MBA program would do when applying to that position. And if they would have applied with the skill set I have, then I start to question, why wouldn't I apply then?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's helpful to pretend like you're someone else. There's a lot of research on self-compassion. Has that come up in any of your interviews, Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So tell me
So,
what's your take on that is.
well, I look at Dr. Kristen Neff from University of Texas Austin, an educational psychologist, research on this topic. And self-compassion, as I understand it, is really around extending to ourselves that same sense of compassion that we would, in kindness, that we would extend to someone that we really care about. It's that understanding of the shared human experience and all of its flaws. So really embracing rather than rejecting those parts of ourselves that we may see as our flaws. And I don't know if there's any research about this, but one of the ways which I've filtered that through the lens of my own experience is thinking about, I might personally not have the confidence to feel like I meet 100% of the criteria in that role. But if I won't know if I don't give it a shot.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. You know, a lot of times in leadership presentations that I give, I sometimes will start it by saying, people say, what is leadership? And I'll often say relationships, relationships, relationships. And so there's a Harvard study on adult development relating to relationships. So I know you're familiar with it. So just tell us, what does that study show us? What does it tell us? And how do you use that in educating your students?
Are you referring to the longitudinal study on happiness
Yeah.
for the last 90 plus years?
Yeah.
I encourage all of our listeners, if you're not unfamiliar with this, please do Google it and read some of the findings because I find them incredibly affirming and helpful. They are that it is the presence of meaningful quality relationships in our lives that really matter. I think that's in really unfortunate juxtaposition with the Surgeon General's recent warnings around the epidemic of loneliness in
Yeah.
America.
Hmm.
So we can certainly talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah. Go ahead to give me your take on it.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on loneliness, but I am working with a colleague here at the University of California, Berkeley on a new course. We hope it will premiere this summer. It's a part of the Berkeley Changemaker suite, and it's called Openness to Opposing Views. And the reason we're creating a course like this is we want to help our students develop the confidence to engage in conversation with someone whom they think may hold a different opinion than their own. And in so doing, feel a little bit less lonely and a little bit more like they're bringing more of themselves into the conversation. So part of it is
Yeah.
helping our students to feel a little less lonely by talking to someone. You mentioned this earlier, and I thought it was wonderful about, talking to somebody in the coffee shop, asking how you're doing.
Yeah. And a good example of that is we just had a recent presidential election. The next morning, I took my car in for a service. And I was at the service counter, and here's, the guy I'm talking to, and a lot of other people around, and whatever. I did not hear one word about the election, which shocked me because people are afraid to give their opinion or to talk about something or whatever. So we've developed a world where you have to be so cautious about what you say and how you say it that sometimes you just don't say anything, which I think is a bad trend in my opinion.
And what a tragedy, because then we may never learn how someone else thinks.
Right.
The shutting down of conversation. So I hope maybe what we might be doing is help just a tiny bit opening the door towards conversation. I know I've done my best thinking and my best learning and my biggest breakthroughs and my biggest moments of self-discovery in talking with people who have different views, who challenge my views, who push my thinking, who cause me to question some of those things which I had always held to be precepts of truth with a capital T.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Laura, in anticipation of our discussion today, what haven't I asked you or what haven't we covered that you think would be good to get into the program?
Hmm. So I don't know. I it's been such a fun and wide-ranging conversation with you, Stephen. I'm so honored to have been in this conversation. I think one thing I'd like to hear from you, and maybe we can think about answering this. Hey, my favorite question of anyone who engages with our Berkeley Changemaker is, what is your best advice for our Berkeley Changemakers? You've had a multifaceted career. You've done so many things and you've heard so many incredible people in this series of this podcast. I think you're approaching number 200, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think I'm about up to 215, 220 now. So yeah, yeah.
So, what would you tell our undergraduates today? What could we share with them?
Uh, I my motto has always been never be afraid to ask the question. So, sometimes just going up to somebody and asking them a question or asking their opinion. I think most people like to be heard. And so if you just ask somebody, well, what do you think about that? Or what's your take on this? Or, in when I'm working with my clients, I say the greatest leadership tool is asking questions. So if you don't know what to say or what to do, ask questions, and then pretty soon it'll come to you as, what's next. So I just say not be afraid to ask the question. And then probably the other thing that we alluded to a little earlier is just realize that um, it's a process and it takes time. There's no way that I can be as experienced and knowledgeable 2 years out of school as someone who's been in the same field for 20, 25, 30 years. So that doesn't mean they're smarter. That doesn't mean that they're better. It just means that they have experience that I have to be willing to um, learn about over time, and I can't buy it, by just going out and doing it. I have to live it, and that takes time. So I guess not to be in too much of a hurry to be at the level you think you should be at. Which sounds counterintuitive, right? Because you'd want people to say, "Oh, push, 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 go, 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 go." But I think that you have to let things percolate and you have to let things develop, and you keep moving forward, but you can't, overwhelm yourself by trying to be at a level that is unattainable until all the pieces fit in.
This podcast is really a master class in how to ask thoughtful questions, right? And how to listen actively. This is the kind of things that I hope for all of my students. I'd like to underscore what you said. One of the In my final lecture in Living with Agency, I depart from the evidence-based research and I share with students my best advice. I'm not going to spoil it all here because I want them to take my class,
Yeah,
but one of them is, you have more time than you think.
yeah,
So many of my students, I feel, I would almost say a lot of anxiety, if that's the right word, and pressure, to have it all figured out by the time they graduate, to have a clear and cogent life plan. And one thing I've learned is that life works in mysterious ways. Things happen that we don't expect and we can't plan for, no matter how good we are at planning. And we also have more time than we think. There are more careers out there available to us than we might know about. There are more opportunities that are continually coming available. I was 40 when I got my MBA, and am now doing a career that I didn't even dream existed, well, in part
right.
because it didn't. And so I encourage my students also
Yeah.
to follow what you said and be patient. Yeah.
Such a good lesson because, you know, if anyone would have told me a couple years out of school that I would be the CEO of this company someday, It just never even entered my mind. It wasn't even on the radar. So I do think if you look at, the type of students that go to Berkeley, the type of students that go to medical school or physical therapy school and whatever, to get there, it's very task oriented and it's very goal oriented. So you do this, you accomplish this, you do this, and then you get in. And then they graduate, and then you put them in a world where you're supposed to just say, well, I don't know, let it go, be a leader, be more right brain thinker and whatever. And I think people struggle with that. So, um, you know, what you're doing, I think, is really cool because it's allowing them to be okay with that because they've been trained, to be honest, to not be those kind of thinkers. Now we let them out in the world and we say, now you need to be this type of thinker. Well, that's a big shift.
Absolutely. And the world is not black and white, right? We operate in shades of great ambiguity. And in many industries, on the cutting edge of change, in situations that are volatile and unpredictable. And so
Yeah,
one of the greatest skills I think that we can have is that flexibility to adapt. And that's not necessarily as something that comes to mind when one is thinking about pursuing a college education. But I think one of the
yeah.
skills that our students are really demonstrating in spades as they are graduating as Berkeley Changemakers and going out into the world and doing just mind-blowing, amazing things.
Yeah, and I think that you said it well. In our society today, we are being forced and pushed to think black and white. And I gave a speech on a national speech in my circles of influence, and the title of it was "I Believe in the Gray." And just because it depends, and sometimes it's this, and sometimes it's that, and maybe I'll learn from this, and I change my mind, and it's not all black and white. That is absolutely a belief I have and I've lived by.
I love that so much. In fact, in this new course, Openness to Opposing Views, that I'm designing, one of the questions that I'm posing to many of the luminaries I'm interviewing is, when is the last time you changed your mind about something important?
Yeah.
So perhaps we could leave our listeners with that question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great. Uh, at this point in the interview, I always ask my guests the same common question. So that question is, in relation to leadership, what is a pearl of wisdom that you could leave us with today?
Oh, I love that question. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible because I've had the privilege of watching so many incredible leaders in action. I would say it is that we have the privilege of leading from any position within a team, whether we have formal authority or not. And so, with that perspective, it is incumbent upon us to figure out the question that we've been struggling with, I think, throughout the context of this interview is that question. Isn't there a better way we might be doing this? Or how might we embark upon a new way? So I would perhaps leave everyone with that empowering question: is regardless of where we are in the organization, whether we are designated a formal leader or not, we have the power to make change happen. And it's asking thoughtful questions like that. It's doing the same type of active listening that Stephen and I have been talking about, that really helps us to superpower that change. And
Yeah.
so go forth. We say at Berkeley, go Bears is how we conclude these. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Well, thank you, Laura. It's been a real pleasure. That's why I love doing this because, you're someone I've never met before. I was unaware of, and I feel like we've just had a really great connected conversation over this last hour. It's been a complete delight for me. I've learned a lot, as I always do, and I think you're doing great things in the world. So keep doing what you're doing, and it's been a real pleasure getting to know you and hearing what you're doing. So thank you for your time today.
The honor is mine. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our listeners.
Okay, take care, Laura. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. To listen to all my interviews, subscribe to Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and many other popular podcast platforms. Some of these interviews are on video, and you can search YouTube for Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson. You can also access the entire library of interviews on my website, orange.coaching.com, and that is orangetheword.coaching.com, and go to the Media Center and click on Podcasts or Video Gallery. You can also enter the website from pilpodcast.com.